evening, everybody. Welcome back to Book Talk at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Mariana Garcia. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Old State House, and I'm just so happy that you've been able to join us today for this series. This series is Book Talk is something that we do to bring audiences and authors together who've written books about civics, history, and everything in between, so that we can have meaningful conversations about those topics while reading some awesome books. So today we are joined by Dr. Wendy Wong, who has written the book We the Data, Human Rights for a Digital Age. She is. So Wendy Wong, she is currently a professor of political science and the Principal's Research Chair at the University of British Columbia in Okanagan. She has written 2 award-winning books, Internal Affairs and The Authority Trap, with Sarah S. Stroop, both published. Well, I think I accidentally deleted the first book, but that's one of the books. But this was published by Cornell University Press. And she has penned dozens of peer-reviewed articles and chapters and has appeared in outlets such as CBC, The Globe and Mail, The Toronto Star, and The Conversation. She has been awarded grants from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada and Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, among other granting agencies. And her newest book is, as I said, We the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age, published by MIT Press in October 2023. And this is a book that the Science magazine has called a timely and engaging exploration. We the Data presents a refreshing, nuanced view on data, and Wong's proposal is a welcome invitation for each of us to reclaim our agency and become full participants in conversations and decisions about how to apply human rights and human values to our data reality. So, Dr. Wong, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you here with us.
Thanks, Mariana, and thank you so much for inviting me to come speak. And I want to thank each and every one of you for attending tonight with us for this wonderful conversation that I'm hoping we're going to have. So I'm talking to you today from the traditional Syilx Okanagan lands in the beautiful Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. And I'm pretty excited to be part of this event and part of this series. So when Mariana first invited me to do this, I think it was still the time when the world had recently met ChatGPT and was starting to understand what generative AI was doing. And I think we were all quite entranced with it. I think some of us were also worried about it and scared about the implications of such technologies. But since then, I think there's just been so much activity around AI. I just don't think you can go a day these days, really, without hearing about AI technologies or AI companies or AI regulations. So that makes sense. It's pretty clear that AI does underlie many of our everyday lives. I think many of us are starting to understand that, whether that means our explicit engagement with chatbots like ChatGPT, or if we're thinking about the implicit uses or behind the scenes uses of AI. So everyone's sort of thinking about AI. Now, I'm a political scientist, and as Mariana said, I wrote a book called We the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age, which came out last year. And I come to the topic of AI, and more specifically, I come to the topic of the massive amounts of data that power and enable AI systems from the view of what we might say a non-techie. Okay, so I don't make these systems, but I do understand how they work. And I think more importantly, I see the implications of their proliferation through a lens of human rights, social movements, and governance, which is where my intellectual past has been. But I'm really here today to talk about, in the short time together, I really want us to think about how to foreground human rights values in our AI future. So from my view, there are 3 basic understandings I'd like to convey, in addition to the content of the book. And I'm hoping we can discuss these ideas. So the first is that AI tools supplement and do not substitute for human activity, creativity, and intelligence. So they're about supplementing our abilities, not substituting human capacity. The second thing I'd like to point out is that AI systems are extremely data dependent. And in order to be intelligent or to mimic human intelligence, they really depend on data that come from human beings. The third point I want to say is that we live in a world of data. Data that exists about our every activity, because our lives are so much mediated by internet-connected devices. And those data and those internet-mediated activities come with good and bad implications. So we have to talk about them as it's sort of in context and in balance. So to me, as a political scientist, I study politics, I study collective action, and now I'm really interested in the way policymakers are reacting to AI. The key to me seems to be understanding the infusion of data about people into our world, what makes those types of data challenging from a governance perspective, from a human rights perspective, and how we can use human rights values to govern those data. So I'm not sure if you guys can see the slides. I'm hoping you can. Okay, there we go. All right. So I like to start with the story about the intersection of three things. That's basketball star and legend Shaquille O'Neal, the TV reality show Shark Tank, and Amazon.com. And the way they intersect is through the Ring doorbell. So Amazon owns Ring company. The item, the Ring doorbell, was initially featured on Shark Tank, and really the company's fortunes turned around when, among other things, Shaq's endorsement really raised the profile of this product in a series of commercials. Now, when I say Ring doorbell, or if we talk about any other video doorbells like the Google Nest or the Arlo and the Blink, the last of which is also owned by Amazon, I think everyone here is quite familiar with these products at this point. Sales surged during the pandemic. They've become part of the landscape of many different neighborhoods in the US and in North America more generally. Now, the Ring doorbell, like other video doorbells, offers people the opportunity to monitor and record the area around their doors or wherever they decide to place these products. They record audio and visual data and allow owners to interact with visitors and answer the door even when they're not home. So you can link a whole bunch of devices together, kind of create your own security system around your home. Now, what these devices effectively do beyond those things that I just mentioned is that they allow private homes to survey. So when we think about surveillance, closed circuit TV monitoring in public spaces, I think that's not an uncommon thing. I think we're quite used to that, or thinking about security systems in malls and other spaces where lots of people go. But what Ring and other doorbells like it enable is actually for homeowners along residential streets and in front of private residences to also survey. And so images and voices are captured in Ring snippets, either audio or visual data. And these data become ways we can analyze the world. Now, in the past, Ring has gotten into some controversy because it has agreements with law enforcement agencies to share the data that Ring devices capture, sometimes without the knowledge or consent of the doorbell's owners. And doorbell owners also, through their subscriptions, can review and download the video and audio captured by their devices. Now, sometimes this also works in a sort of more headline capturing way. So there have been a number of documented cases where people actually experience the hijacking of the camera or the two-way microphone on Ring cameras, which allowed the stalking of children, the elderly, and other unsuspecting users. In other words, flipping the surveillance on those who were doing the surveillance to their own Ring devices. And that's a headline capturing thing. That doesn't happen as often as we, as the pedestrians or as the drivers, who are unlikely to be able to really see these devices as we go on through our day, as we walk through our neighborhoods or run our errands. We're not necessarily aware, we're not consenting, no matter how mundane or how harmless, to data about our faces, the way we walk, which is called a gait, how the patterns of our behavior being captured on these Ring devices. And practically speaking, it would be very difficult to consent because we don't actually know how many people have these devices or whether they're on or not. And so, I really want us to think about how the Ring is just one of countless what we call smart objects recording and sharing data about us and with various entities, be they corporate or government. Those entities have an interest in collecting data about people from people. Now, I think when I first started talking about the book, it was more surprising perhaps when I talked about the amount of data that are being collected about people. I feel like as I've talked more about the book and as more people are aware of the data intensiveness of AI, these days people more shrug than gasp when I talk about the amount of data being collected. In some ways, it feels like old news that big tech takes data when we use their wares. But I think what's really important, actually, in light of this insight, is that we have to ask ourselves how it feels to live in this system of constant data making, and whether we want to be part of this system in the way that it is constructed now. I think a lot of times people feel like we can't help but fall victim, or at least be part of these types of data creation processes because of the way our daily lives are structured and organized. So, most of us have smartphones. We depend on the internet to conduct day-to-day activities, and we engage with digital technologies that record data about people, whether we like it or not. This is things like tapping into public transit with your card, or patronizing stores that use loyalty programs, or even facial recognition technology, having purchasing histories that are analyzed and tracked through websites and apps. So these are things that are not necessarily things we post on social media, which we might be very much aware of, but things we do as a part of a routine, as part of our everyday, walking by houses with digital doorbells like the Ring, which within their walls often feature digital assistants like Alexa. Our lives, in short, are datafied. And what datafication means is that the behaviors that can be very much revealing of our thoughts and activities and choices, the way we live our lives, in other words, have become digital data. And modern human life, I would argue, is characterized by a veneer of datafication that has been added to, in addition to all the other things that we do as part of and parcel of how we live. And I think another way to think about this is that a big part of human life has actually been made into data. There are lots and lots of facets of human life that have now become part of the data ecosystem. So this is what we mean when we say datafication. Now, my book is about why the feeling of living in this system, and in fact, the volume of data being recorded in order to enable smart systems that are powered by AI algorithms or other types of AI systems that assist in a lot of everyday tasks, but also require tons of data about people. This is not an inevitable situation, right? It's not inevitable. In fact, there are a lot of choices that could be made. A lot of choices have already been made, but there are ways we can shift the trajectory of how we live without necessarily, without calling for the banning or disappearance of AI systems. I think that is not the point here. There are 5 takeaways I write about in the book. I have a few minutes remaining, so I'm going to talk about quickly 2 of them, and we can talk about the rest in the Q&A. I want to talk about data stickiness and why we need human rights more than ever in a world of datafication. So let me talk about the first thing, which is data stickiness. So when I say data stickiness, I really mean data are sticky like gum on the bottom of your shoe. It's really easy to step on gum, get it stuck, really embedded in there. And often it can be really hard to extract that embedded, stuck gum. In a similar way, we can think about how data about our activities and our thoughts, they're really easy to create. We do them in the process of living our lives. But unlike gum, we may not be aware of the types of data being collected or the extent of the data being collected. It's not just things we choose to do consciously and enter into a device, but there are many, many, many other things that are being collected. And we may not even know about the data being collected, right? So it's not even just trying to get rid of the gum or the data. It's also not even knowing that the data are there. And one of the things that I think, in our day and age, we're very familiar with digital data. We know that what makes them really valuable is that digital data allows information to be easily copied and easily transferred. And so it's not just about those qualities. When I talk about data stickiness, I'm not just referring to that. I think there are 4 other reasons why data about people are particularly sticky. The first is what I've already kind of alluded to, which is that the data that are being collected are really mundane. They're everyday things. They aren't extraordinary. In fact, some people might say they're boring, right? They're just describing how you live your life. But if you aggregate all those data, of course, there's a richness to understanding how not just how you individually live your life, but how people like you go about living their everyday lives. So these are usually unavoidable things, or it'd be really costly to change, or simply difficult to really change routines. The second reason why data are sticky is because they're linked. And that's, referring to the idea that when we collect data about human activity, we're not just collecting it to have it sit in a data set and not be shared among other data sets. And so we link all kinds of data together. And so you might have data deleted from one data set, but those data about your activities have already been shared across a variety of data sets to extract information and insights. Now, this can be positive or negative. We can think about the insights we can get from data, but then also we can think about concerns like privacy or safety or discrimination that can result in the pooling of data. Data are also sticky because they're effectively forever. It's very hard to actually verify that something about you has been deleted, something digitally stored about you has been deleted, because data are very easily copied and transferable. And finally, data are sticky because they're co-created, and they're co-created for two reasons. One is that to make a data point, right, we really need both the subject of the data, so that's everybody, that's all of us, and someone who's interested in actually making those data. So that would be like a company in a lot of cases, sometimes a government, but typically new data are created through an unlikely collaboration of sorts between the data collector, which is the company, and the source of data, which is all of us. And without either the source or the collector, you don't have data, right? You just have activity. And so one of the things that we need to think about is whose data are they? Are they yours because the data describe you and because you're the source of the data? Or are they the company's data because they are the creators of the data? They've gone ahead and created data out of human behavior. And I think that's a really important point and something that has yet to be settled. I think going beyond that, it's also really important to point out that any sort of data collected about an individual goes beyond that individual in the sense that the data being extracted has implications not just for you, but for people like you. And this is a category that is often created algorithmically, right, through AI system analysis. You may not even know the people who are like you, but the point is the data are collective in implication, even if we individually experience data collection. So we have to, I think that's the final point about emphasizing the stickiness of data. It's not just about you. Now, I want to turn quickly to thinking about human rights in my last few minutes here, because I think it's really important to make this link. So how do we think about human rights in the context of sticky data in a world of AI systems that depend on sticky data about human beings? So, it's really hard actually to describe what human rights are in a way because they've become so embedded in modern society. But I would say that the best thing I've ever seen in terms of a definition is what political scientist Jack Donnelly argues, that human rights are not about what we are today, but what we might become. And so I think what human rights are really for, why we need them, is that they're about human potential and protecting that potential. And I like to think about this in the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a document that was produced after World War II, around the same time the United Nations itself was founded. And through years of negotiations, country delegates came together. They negotiated a set of 30 articles they saw as key to the establishment of international human rights. Importantly, international human rights are universal, unconditional, and interdependent. Those are three sort of embedded values of these rights. That's why they are international. And they're different from ethics in the sense that human rights are entitlements that a person or a group has against states. So states are responsible for protecting human rights in a way that other entities cannot at this moment. And when we think about human rights, I know a lot of us think about freedom of expression here in North America. Freedom from torture is another one. But there's also the right to education, the right to choose a marriage partner, the right to a fair trial. And since 1948, there have been 9 human rights treaties signed through the UN. And that's just at the UN, at the United Nations level. There is just a really thick ecosystem of human rights out there. And so sometimes when we talk about human rights, it's hard to get away from this ecosystem of rights because there's so many. But I want to, again, turn back to 1948 to help us think through why human rights exist. And, you know, as I mentioned, there were 30 different articles in the UDHR. This is the framework document of the international human rights system. And there were already 30 different human rights areas, which is a lot. And what they tried to do was put together this this portico. Rene Cassin, who's one of the founders of the UDHR, came up with a framework to sort of put human rights into a house. They all fit together in a house. And even though there are lots of different types of rights, they all kind of work together to make to hold up the house of humanity, so to speak. And that's really, you know, that's one way to think about human rights, is how to squash them into a house together. But I also want to point to the foundation. The foundation of any building, as any builder will know, is critical to the success of that building and to the longevity of that building. And as you see on this slide, there are 4 values, we can say, right? Foundational values of international human rights. On the slide at the time, this is dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And this is what I really focus on in my book. Not individual rights like the freedom of expression or the right to privacy, but the values of human rights. Thinking about something like equality, which is the desire to be treated without discrimination and in accordance to a common baseline. It's about dignity, feeling like you have worth, being treated as though you have worth. It's about, in the book, what I talk about, instead of liberty, autonomy, because it's not just about freedom, right? Autonomy means agency, not just being free, but being able to act. And that's a really important distinction, especially in the AI age we find ourselves in. We can talk about that more. And finally, what they called it brotherhood in 1948, I call it community now in 2023, 2024, which is another way to think about how we all belong in a social system or multiple social systems together. We're members of the human community. And what I would say is that the UDHR and these values that hold up the UDHR and every other international human rights framework out there really focused, of course, on physical harm, because that's what they had to work with in the 1940s. That's what they were worried about, you know, until very, very recently. And it's now, when we think about data and the stickiness of data and how that affects how we can exercise autonomy and dignity, how we can, you know, treat each other equally, and how all these factors around, you know, AI selection and recommender algorithms, they're changing the way we think about who belongs in our community. And there are lots of questions now around these values, not because those values aren't important, because those values are changing in light of or are being affected rather by our technologies and by datafication. So I'm just gonna, you know, show quickly the contents of the book. These are the chapters or the topics that I really touch on in the book, and I'm happy to talk about them during the Q&A. I don't think human rights are a silver bullet. I don't think there's a fix-it for where we find ourselves in terms of datafication and AI. But I think we have to remember these values of autonomy, community, dignity, and equality to get us started down a conversation about how to govern AI, and more importantly, how to govern data. How do you treat data about human beings? And I think that's a really important place to start as we go forward, and just to, you know, also think about data as being collective, that individual choices matter, but they don't always matter in the way we might think about them in the pre-digital age. So if we think about something like DNA are shared, they're inherently co-created data, right? And we as individuals don't have a lot of discretion over how individuals related to us choose to engage with services like 23andMe, these DNA services that once they're used, DNA is not just about the individual who submits the swab, it's also about everyone related to them. Right? And you may not know that you're part of a data set now of DNA information. And because we don't know where data go, data are practically forever because we can't verify that they aren't, I think it's really important to think about how this affects the way we live our lives when data really stick around quite a bit longer than we do as human beings. So let me end my comments there, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was really, really eye-opening, maybe I should say. A lot of things I had never, ever considered, like data being co-created by the person that does the thing and then the entity that collects the data about the thing. That's never thought of that before like that. Yeah, so I have a couple of questions for you. Please, anybody who is watching us live, please do join the chat. Let us know what you think and post your questions, and we will share them with Dr. Wong. But in the meantime, I would love to learn about your book writing journey a little bit. So why did you decide to write this book now? And can you tell us a little bit about the process of how it came to be?
Yeah, I started writing this book right a few months before the pandemic, I'd say. Really thinking about new projects. So there are a couple of reasons. One is that I had a really interesting conversation with someone I've known for a very long time, and he was talking about some of the possibilities enabled by AI technologies, including, this idea that we can translate every single thing that human beings have ever made into any language we want, which of course we really have now with things like Google Translate. And at the time, so this is in 2019, I thought, wow, this is something I don't know a whole lot about, and it sounds really it really fundamentally changes how we live if we have access to all the information that's ever been created by human beings. So I thought that was really neat. And as someone who does human rights and who had done human rights for a long time, I thought, well, if it changes fundamentally how we live, then I think this is a question for human rights in terms of thinking about the protections we need to be thinking about for each and every one of us as we go down this digital path. But the other thing was, I had a couple of kids, and that really forced me to think about all the things that my friends and acquaintances were posting on social media. And I really started thinking very hard about the legacy of those postings, and thinking about the type of world that my kids, but also, kids in general have been born into. I mean, there's so many issues at stake here, not, climate change being another one of these situations that people are born into nowadays. But I really wanted to think about AI because it really fascinated me in a way that I think, as a human rights scholar, I really wanted to think about how do these technologies change humanity? Do they? And in what way do they change? Are they here to take our place, or are they here to help us as tools we develop as human beings? So that's really where I got started. Having an interesting conversation and having kids, I suppose.
Thank you. Okay, so you did go a little bit over this during your presentation, but could you go a bit more into detail of what datafication is? It sounds a little scary.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little scary, right? I mean, so I think when people say data or data, there's a tendency to think it's very technical. But really what data, if we think about what it means to make data, why do we make data? We make data as human beings all the time because we're trying to make sense of the world. So in a way, the way that our brain processes stimuli or things we experience is we try to categorize things. We're trying to make sense of the world. And that's what data really is about. So when we talk about datafication, we're talking about the quantification of the world in a way that can be readable by a computer, right? So it's sort of taking this idea of making data. So you can make data by writing notes to yourself with words. You can make other types of symbols. When we talk about datafication and its relationship to digital technologies, what we're really talking about is making data that is readable by a computer, quantifying the world so that a computer can process that information that we bring in and those data that we make. So, and I think in the book, I'm really talking about how so many facets of our lives that would have gone unrecognized or unacknowledged now have become data. I was just thinking about this today. I was driving home and my car, I was a little too close to the white line on the side of the road, and my car shook a little bit to tell me, hey, you're crossing a boundary, right? Like, Don't do that. And that gets recorded, right? Your car is recording those activities and that kind of event in a way that would not have happened if in a car that wasn't a smart car, equipped with so much sensor and computing technology. It simply would have been that I crossed the line. I noticed I make the small adjustment as a seasoned driver to get back in the center of the lane. And I think it's at that point, another example, I recently went to Disneyland and we walked a whole lot of steps, right? And I was really curious to see how my phone, I don't turn on my health app on my iPhone, but somehow when I was really looking through the data, my phone has been collecting data about my steps for as long as I've had the phone, down to each set of steps, right? So it's not only just the day and how many total, but every day is broken down into little step units. So, I walk this at this time, I walk 65 steps, for example, right? And it's all in there. These are things that are not remarkable. They're not important, but we've quantified them. We've datafied them. If those examples help.
Yeah, I know there's an app also that records how loudly you snore at night.
Oh, there's an app for everything. There's an app for that. I mean, Steve Jobs wasn't wrong. And that's what I mean by datafication, is that the only way these apps work is if you take behaviors or activities or choices and you make them into digital data. That's how that works, right?
Right. So every little thing about our lives can become information.
That's right. Or every little thing that can become information, digital information, is in the process of becoming that if it hasn't already, right?
Right. All right. So why don't we go a little bit into the past before we were having all of these crazy conversations about AI and data. So you mentioned in your book, and I really like this part where you say that at the start of the internet, so late 80s, early 90s, people were very hopeful about the potential for the internet and technology to alleviate inequality. So in retrospect, what do you think those people would be saying about those technologies today? So how would those ideas would have changed by now?
I think that's great. I mean, I think that's really a sociology question in a way, because when we think about so you're talking about an even earlier day than I typically would think about with the internet, right? With the internet, it's really about around the 2000s when Al Gore says, he invented the internet. This is the information superhighway. But I think we can go back a little bit farther to what you said. The creators of networked computing, of the internet, were a remarkably homogenous set of people. Right, we're talking about one or two major centers in the United States that were creating a lot of the technologies that we now take for granted as the internet, as the World Wide Web. And so it's sociological in the sense that they're very small communities that have very homogenous thinking, right? And so there wasn't a lot of diversity. There's, in terms of any dimension you want to think about, whether race or gender or class or even, a college affiliation. I mean, still to this day, we have, typically you have your top 5 computer science programs feeding into many, many, many of the companies that are creating the apps that we enjoy today. So this has not gone away. There are a lot of people have written about how the tech companies are very white and male and stale. And there's a lot of writing about that. So I don't want to belabor that point, but I think more sociologically is that you don't see the things that are obvious when you bring in the rest of society, right? When you bring in these diverse elements, you can understand that there's, varieties to accessing the internet. I mean, that used to be something that we really worried about. There are ways that data about marginalized peoples can be used against them. So there have been quite a number of books out there, like Cathy O'Neil, for example, or Virginia Eubanks, Ruha Benjamin. They have written extensively about how data about the marginalized people, the poor, the unhoused, racialized communities, gets used against those communities because because they don't have a choice, right? Because they don't have it. They're not privileged in the same way that the creators of those technologies are. So in a way, I mean, that the people didn't think that there would be such high inequality and inequity resulting from their technologies. I think because they were looking at these systems and saying, wow, I can communicate in real time with my, somebody in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or I can communicate in real time with someone in Palo Alto to work on, advancements in technologies. Or I think that's really what it was. It's that you have, very homogenous group of people working on a wide set of technologies that had implications for the rest of us without the input of the rest of us. And then we're seeing that still with AI systems, and the way that data are being collected about all of us. I mean, none of us have really said that our faces could become data, and yet facial recognition systems are out there. They're being used all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I should also think that physical access to these technologies and like stable internet, stable connection and all that is also like not something that people were thinking about back then. I don't think people realize how many homes don't even have a computer.
Right. I mean, because it was limited to a certain type of person, right? And I think there are lots of ways the internet can be very informative and eye-opening and world-changing, for sure, for individuals who have access to all the information that's out there on the web. On the other hand, not having access to the internet on a routine basis also excludes you from some of the datafication that has happened, which actually, is in some ways, in a perverse way, a benefit, in the sense that there's not that much of your life being taken as data, in the same way that, those of us like me, I live myself in, I'm very dependent on my devices, and there's tons of data about what I do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, since we're in the topic already, why don't we talk about a little bit how this data collection and the data that is actually being collected by these marginalized communities, how could it be used against it? How could it be, how could it negatively affect these communities?
Well, there's some really good examples out there. So, one is using AI systems to decide bail or to decide whether someone deserves parole, right? The marginalized community, like if you think about what is the epitome of a marginalized community, would be the imprisoned population that is in the United States, and any imprisoned population. They have had their rights taken away because they've been convicted of a crime. And so to use automated systems to decide their fate, how much longer they have to be in jail, whether they get out of jail, that's, I think, the epitome of thinking about how datafication can be used on marginalized communities, and how they make these decisions, of course, is thinking about recidivism rates in the past, right? Using data from previous parole, other prisoners, or prisoners like the one that has appeared before the parole board, right? So I think that's one way to really think about it. Another way, I have a lot of examples in my book, and the other one that really sticks out to me that I talk about very early on in the book is how people who are, looking for a lease, for example, looking to rent a home, a lot of times they are confronted with zombie data from their past, right? So things that they may have done wrong in the past that they think have been expunged, or they simply didn't think had anything to do with whether they can secure housing or not. Or if you have a very common name, that other people's data can get attached to yours and then put into one database, which then gets sold to other companies that also are trying to figure out whether you're a reliable renter, right? To spit out a score about whether someone should be renting to you. And so a lot of these companies are using multiple data sets to try to create a prediction about whether you're a good candidate for tenancy. And so those data that might be wrong, that might be expired, that might be irrelevant, that might be tied to somebody else, that all gets mixed in and stuck on you as you go and apply for one place. You get denied, you apply for another place. The landlord uses maybe a different service, but it's the same underlying data, right? So I think those are two examples we can think about. One where it's very clearly, prisoners are marginalized populations in our society. But also, when we think about, especially some of the inequality in North American society today, renters versus homeowners, right? Renters are increasingly also falling into a category of vulnerability as well in terms of housing security.
Thank you. Yeah. So you already started to talk about this a little bit, but how accurate is actually all this data that is being collected?
That is such a tough question to answer, right? Because so this has to do with the collectors and the sources. So how accurate is data about all of us? It's as accurate at base with how accurate the sort of data collectors inferences that they're trying to draw about the world are. So they're collecting data about your gait, right? The way you walk. And so then the accuracy of those data are how accurate those sensors are, for example. And then what kinds of implications are you trying to draw from gait data, or when you think about facial data or any sort of behavioral data that allows the data collector and other people interested in data analysis to draw inferences. So how good is the data, I think, is how accurate is it? You can answer that in two ways. How well was the behavior or the thought tracked, right? So how accurate is your sensor? How sensitive is it? But then how accurate is it to describe things in the real world? So what does your face mean? What does the data about your face mean? What does the data about the way you walk mean? What is the way you know, your search history in Google, what does that tell us about you as a human being? That part of the accuracy, I think, is really, what are the assumptions built into the way that the data collector has collected the data and the way they use those data? And so I think that's one way to think about your accuracy question, is that you may not be, the data being collected may not actually reveal the information you want, or that in the real, it might not be linked to real world behavior in the way that data collectors assume that they are. But the second thing goes back to, I think what most people would be thinking about is, well, do the data attached to me, Wendy Wong, or you, Mariana Garcia, do they accurately describe my personal history, right? Did I really do the wrong things or the good things that somehow popped out a credit score? And I think that, again, this is really, it depends on a lot of things, but I would say these systems are not foolproof, right? And I think that data can get, it can get corrupted, it can get lost, and the more it sort of spreads around and gets merged into these different data sets, and you know, having worked with quantitative data in my work, you know, sometimes as a researcher, you're making assumptions about what things go together, and you merge them together to get another measurement. And you think that, okay, that tells me something about the world. But if someone else takes my data that I've created and says, oh, I'm just going to use this data set to find some other results, they may not have the same assumptions I've built into the data, and yet those are there. I've labeled, you know, something as an indicator of a social behavior or social outcome, and you have to take that as given. So I think the accuracy question is really tough to answer, and I also think we know from just anecdotally that data aren't accurate. You know, that there are transcription problems, there are problems with data not being expunged from all the data sets that have those data. So it's really tough to answer that question, but I would say that we can't assume, just because there's a number attached to it, that any data point is accurate.
Right. And I think it's safe to say that maybe this kind of system creates an echo chamber of itself. Like maybe I buy shoes one day and then suddenly the algorithm keeps showing me shoes, and then I keep clicking on those ads, and she thinks, oh, she really likes shoes, but maybe that's not my thing, but I just needed shoes that one time, but now all I see is shoes.
No, I was just complaining to someone yesterday about my Spotify feed. It is because when I write, I tend to listen to like one thing because it helps me focus, but it also provides distraction. But now Spotify thinks that I only like one type of music. I guess I just overtrained it. And I've been trying to, you know, give it some variety to let it know I'm actually more interesting and varied as a listener. But it's exactly like that. You get locked into, you know, some people have called these filter bubbles. You get locked into these algorithmic tunnels. however you want to describe it, it's the algorithms trying to predict behavior based on the past. And so, yes, in the past 2-3 months, Wendy has been very repetitive in her music listening. So Spotify thinks that is what Wendy is as a music listener.
Right. It's creating behavior rather than, than watching your behavior.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about AI, because I think everybody's talking about AI, and we've already talked about it a little bit tonight.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand that AI uses data sets, like these huge data sets, to learn and become AI, right? So what is usually the result of AI using this data that, as we already talked about, may or may not be completely accurate?
So AI needs 3 things in the secret sauce, right? It needs data, lots and lots and lots of data. AI systems also need algorithms. So this is telling the computer what to do, what to look for, okay, in the data. And then what computer scientists call compute, which is basically the resources that are available for the computer to use in its calculations and its predictions. So these are the 3 things that you need to create an AI system. And a lot of times I think we focus on the algorithm. People have been talking about governing the algorithm or regulating algorithms since Frances Haugen's testimony on Capitol Hill about Facebook. But these systems don't work in the absence of tremendous vats of data. And we're talking about just billions and billions of fields that, you know, a system like an LLM, a large language model, is trying to model, right? Because human language, English, is so complicated, and people have used it in so many different ways. So they need a lot of data to truly create systems that can write and talk eventually like human beings. So when we think about the importance of data to AI, I don't think we can understate that. Of course, there's algorithmic innovation. Really smart people are working really hard to create very advanced systems using the latest computing methods, right? Inventing different ways to code things, different ways to use resources, hardware and software resources. But I think that without the tremendous push of data, you just don't have a very advanced AI system. And I say this because, you know, really, so before everyone got excited about ChatGPT and large language models, we were talking about deep learning, right? Deep learning is a way to use tremendous amounts of data and not train the computer to do any particular thing, but to see how the algorithms sort out the world. How do they find patterns in this messy field of data? And these models, these deep learning models, didn't work too well before really the 2000s. There are 2 reasons, one of which is the data. There just wasn't enough data out there. And all of a sudden we had the big data revolution with all these sensors and our handheld devices and other ways to really track behavior and to really be providing lots of data points for how people live and what people are doing. So that's one part. It's the big data revolution. And the other part is that computing resources got really cheap, right? Or relatively cheap. And so the data, though, you can have all the computing power in the world and you can have all the really neat and cool algorithms you want. But if there are no data, the AI system is not going to work. So that's why this is now, you know, been a couple months now, but you know, it was reported that OpenAI was scraping YouTube for data against the terms of use of YouTube, of course. But they've gotten to the point where they've already looked at all the freely available or easily available sources of data. Now they need to find the not so easy sources of data. And so to truly think about AI in the sort of way that some computer scientists want us to think about, this artificial general intelligence, a computer that can think like and be like a human being, we're talking about so much data. It's really hard to imagine how much data are really necessary to really recreate a human being. I think it's sort of unfathomable at this point. And so that's why I think data are so important to the AI process, but also to human rights, to the way we live. Do we want our lives to become data in a very literal way, on a second by second way? You know, it's not just, you know, minute by minute, it's second by second, it's millisecond by millisecond. How we live is becoming data. And is that what we want going forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do we want the most important decisions to be made using data rather than, a human's common sense?
Or even what decisions ought to be automated? I think that's a real question. So I talked about like parole and bail, like that's, those were testing grounds, right? To see the validity of the system. But at the same time, is that just? Is that treating parolees as though they have dignity? And dignity is a really hard thing to define, but at the same time, I think we know when something's inhumane. I think at a gut level, people know what it means to act humanely versus inhumanely, to treat someone as though they are worth something versus to treat someone as though they're an object. And I think as we move down this path of datafication, we are treating individual living people as objects to be mined of data. And we're really, I think, getting to the point where people may feel like that's part and parcel with the process of progress and innovation. And I think I'd like to be one of those voices that says, well, this is not the way it was even 10 years ago. And it doesn't have to be the way it is going forward. We can think about ways that data should not be accessed, right? That we should protect certain parts of human life from datafication.
Yeah, and it's possible people don't even realize how close to home these things actually are. Like, for example, I know that a lot of companies use AI to filter resumes from people that are applying for jobs there, and they won't even look at the resumes that don't go through that filter that AI is doing.
Absolutely. And does that build in the biases that were already there? Is that better than a biased set of human reviewers, right? Who had come to the table with their own views about what's right, what's good, what's accurate. You have those same people, or you have other people with different views of what's right, what's good, what's accurate, building in to the system those biases, and then you end up replicating them as you accept the sort of the scores that the machine spits out. So I think it's really hard in some ways to get out of this feedback loop that we've created. But I think the first step is recognizing that there's a loop. And the second thing is deciding, well, is this how we want our societies to be? Is this progress? Is this for the good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're running a little short on time, but before we start wrapping up, there's one thing I really wanted to talk about is data literacy. You mentioned data literacy during your presentation. Could you go a little bit more in depth of what data literacy is and also why it's so important if we want to hold these systems accountable?
Yeah. Well, I think if we don't, as a society, understand what data are, then I don't think it's easy to combat the forces of datafication. So literacy is a really difficult term to define, actually. When I started this project, I wouldn't have thought that. But literacy is really about competence, right? I think that's what it boils down to, is to be able to function in day-to-day living. So when we talk about literacy, we often talk about linguistic literacy. And I would say, especially reading, right, and writing. Those are two functions that I would say, in 2024, you can't live without. Okay, so you have to be able to read and you have to be able to write. And those who cannot are really excluded from many, many social, political, economic, and even cultural experiences. That's why linguistic literacy is important. We also talk about numeric literacy. If you don't know how to do basic math, you can't make good decisions or competent decisions in the marketplace, right? Or in any sort of exchange, because our exchanges are so much about numbers and quantification. So data literacy is another way to say, now that the world has become very much datafied, everyone needs to have competence around data. And that does not mean expertise. So when I say everyone needs data literacy, it doesn't mean everyone should be a data scientist, because we don't need that many data scientists in the world. But we do need everyone to be literate about the products and the developments that data scientists and computer scientists and AI engineers are coming up with. We have to understand how data are created. And so a lot of times when I talk about AI, people want to talk about bias or discrimination. And AI systems are discriminatory and data are biased. We need unbiased data. You'll see a lot of companies saying that they have clean or unbiased data sets. There's no such thing as unbiased data. And I think that that is something that many people perhaps haven't thought about because they get stuck on the data. They think data is math. Data, as I said earlier, is not math necessarily. It can be math. It is currently mathish in our society, but it doesn't have to be. It's really about sorting and making order out of life and out of our experiences. So data literacy, understanding what data are, understanding how different types of data collection have different implications, so including analog versus digital forms of data, understanding how data can be manipulated, how data can be made to represent the world in ways that perhaps are not the only way to understand the world. I think that sort of basic framework, in the same sense that learning how to read is really about understanding basic pieces of words to then make more words or understand longer words that you've never seen before. This is what that's about. And so I talk about data literacy as a human right because I don't think that the great majority of us are going to be making AI systems, but all of us are affected by AI systems. And because AI systems are so data dependent, it's really important to be a critical, knowledgeable, competent consumer of data, I suppose, and also a target of data and a source of data. So I think in that sense, data literacy is super important to modern society.
Right. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really one of the things that we at the Old State House think is most important, to be literate about data, civics, media. It's just about learning how to deal with the information that you have, right?
Yeah, how to exist, right? How to live your life and experience your life in a way that is communicated collectively, right? Is that none of us exist in a bubble. So we have to understand what other people are trying to tell us. And data have become a way that we communicate with each other, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're running close to the end of the program tonight. I haven't seen any questions coming in. If anybody has any questions, please do post them on the chat or in the comments. Last call. But while we're waiting, just to wrap things up, Dr. Wong, so do you think that these technologies are advancing way too fast for us to keep up as a society? And what do you think we can do as a society and as individuals to protect ourselves from becoming just points of data, and to make sure that human rights are taken into account as legislation and changes develop?
I think that, in the long term, it's about data literacy. It's about becoming familiar and comfortable and competent with data. I think in the meantime, it's incumbent on people, not just those who create these systems, to be talking. I think that policymakers and the media and all sorts of people who are trying to communicate to the public need to be talking to, sure, you can talk to AI scientists to understand their systems, but sometimes they don't. In fact, I know often people who create these systems are not trained as social scientists. They don't think about the world in the same way as social scientists, which is to think about the implications of some sort of external shock or a new innovation like AI. I think it's really important to be speaking to people who understand how things change, to have longer views. It's not just about AI. AI is just the thing of the moment. But, cars were a thing of the moment at the turn of the last century, right? We were thinking about what to do with these cars and how do they affect our lives, which had nothing to do with cars up until the point that they became viable as products for distribution. And I think that's the same thing here. We're looking at AI. We're talking to people who create the AI. They want to make it sound as mystical and magical as possible because they're trying to sell us something. And big tech they're companies, right? They're not doing this for free. So I do think it's really important to not just ask leading AI companies, what do they think their products are going to be doing? They're going to be telling us all sorts of things that may or may not come to fruition. Between, this projected artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence, and now there are many, many choices that have to be made, that we may as individuals make, that we might get together with other individuals to form groups to make, and certainly that policymakers need to make. And they can't really continue listening to AI companies asking them what they want, right? When it comes to governance, we need to ask not just AI companies or certain types of groups, but all some groups that have gotten together and really thought about this, those are the minority. I think we need to ask everyday people, what do you think about the automation of X, Y, and Z process? How do you feel if, your therapist is a robot and not a person? How does that affect your ability to seek care for mental health issues, for example? How do you feel about filling out a form to apply for a job or to send in a video of yourself responding to different prompts, and then to be denied for the opportunity for a job because a robot doesn't think that you're a reliable worker or a trustworthy person based on your video, right? I mean, I think these are really important questions we're not asking ourselves. We're still sort of in that entrancement phase where we think, okay, so what can AI do for me now? And I think we need to think, that's right, but what can we do to make sure that we don't become dependent on AI or thinking that AI is going to solve all our problems? Because I think that it's important that humans are in charge of human society.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. That was beautifully said. And thank you so much for being with us today. That was really, really, really important. All the research that you're doing, we need more people like you asking these questions, thinking about these things, and writing books like yours.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here, and I really appreciated the time.
Yeah, so everybody, please do check out Dr. Wong's book. It's on Amazon. Anywhere else that they should be looking for the book?
It should be available everywhere you can get a book. So, yeah,
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that is We the Data, Human Rights for the Digital Age. And this program tonight has served as a wonderful primer for our upcoming in-person series at the Old State House. So it's going to start actually this coming Friday, and it's called Control Shift Democracy. This is going to be a program all about all the things that Dr. Wong has talked about today, the importance of having these conversations about technology and how they impact governance, society. So this coming Thursday, July the 11th, we're going to talk about AI and how it's changing government. Then next Thursday, we're going to be talking about big data. And then finally, on July 25th, we're going to be talking about the digital divide and digital equity. So if you are in the Hartford area, I hope you can join us in person at Connecticut's Old State House in Hartford. But otherwise, the programs will also be live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. So I hope you can join us online. So all the information, you can find it on the Connecticut's Old State House website, Facebook, all the places you can find some information about that. And I hope we can see you there later this week. So thank you so much again, Dr. Wong, for joining us. Everybody also, thank you for joining us from wherever it is that you're watching. I hope you have a wonderful evening.